Hello, hello, hello. So, we are smack dab in the middle of what historians call the long 19th century. And it's called that because the 19th century, the 1800s, it's just filled with all of this critically important stuff. So, we've started by talking about one of the major events of the 19th century, and that is, of course, the French Revolution. And today, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking about in some regards, you could think of it as part of the French Revolution, and that is the Haitian Revolution. Now, the reason I'm doing this as a video lecture instead of just doing a crash course on it is because I tend to think that we don't pay enough attention to the Haitian Revolution because in some ways, this right here, this revolution that we're talking about today is way more revolutionary than anything we talked about last week. Like, forget the American Revolution. The French Revolution, what with the chopping off of heads and rewriting of time, was pretty cool, but the Haitian Revolution totally upends a social order. It ends chattel slavery in a place that had never, that doesn't happen very often. So we're really going to try to spend some time on this because I think it deserves our time and our respect. So here we go, Haitian Revolution. So you should have your notes. I do apologize. This isn't a very pretty PowerPoint, but just kind of bear with me. So the first thing you have to know is where does this revolution occur? And the revolution occurs on an island known as Hispaniola. Today it is made up of two countries. It's Haiti on one side. It's kind of the crab pincher side of the island, and the Dominican Republic on the eastern side. But during the colonial period, the French side of the island was known as Saint-Domingue. Okay, and the Spanish colony was known as Santo Domingo. They were named after the same saint, Saint Dominic, but they had either French or Spanish names depending on what country colonized it. So by the 1700s, by the beginning of the 18th century, Saint-Domingue was France's most important colony anywhere. It was so much more important than, say, like the Canadian territories that the French held, or territories that the French held in the East Indies, or anything like that. The West Indies was where the French made their money, and that is because they used Saint-Domingue for plantation agriculture. In particular, they produced sugar and they produced coffee. So the form of slavery that was practiced in Saint-Domingue was chattel slavery. And we talked about chattel slavery several units ago. And we talked about just how not just problematic, but incredibly alienating and dehumanizing the practice is. But beyond that, chattel slavery in Saint-Domingue was particularly brutal, not because the French were any more brutal than, say, the English or the Spanish were in terms of chattel slavery, but because of the crops they were growing. So they were growing sugar. And sugar was incredibly labor intensive and very dangerous to produce. And so as a result, the lifestyle and the lifespan of people who were enslaved in Saint-Domingue was generally way lower than people who were enslaved in other systems. Like in the southern American colonies by the British, like here in Georgia, chattel slavery was definitely used and it was incredibly exploitative and dangerous and deadly, but people generally lived to reproduce, which had its own problems. They generally lived to reproduce. In Saint-Domingue, they didn't necessarily do that. So all of the crops that were grown in Saint-Domingue were cash crops, meaning that they were luxury items. They were things that you didn't need to survive, but people wanted anyway. So sugar, cotton, coffee, all of those things were incredibly important for France's economy. And if you remember, during the 18th century up to the very beginning of the French Revolution, France is in trouble economically, right? They're constantly at war. They're at war with the English in the 7 Years' War. They're going to war to try and acquire more territory in Europe. And then the revolution happens and they're just flat broke. And so as a result, having this incredibly important colony really matters to the French. So, just so you understand kind of the demographics of place, that is like what the population of Saint-Domingue looked like. In Saint-Domingue, prior to the revolution, during the 18th century, there were about 500,000 people who were primarily of African descent, usually like either first generation or second generation, born into enslavement in Saint Domingue. And so you have 500,000 people who are enslaved. And then you had about 40,000 white planters, and these people were known as the Grand Blancs, the big whites, like to translate it, like quite literally. The Grand Blancs owned plantations, and most of them didn't actually even live on the island. Many of them kind of just left the plantations to the work of overseers, and then just lived off of the profits. But generally speaking, there were only about 40,000 Grand Blancs on the island at any given time. And if you compare that to the number of enslaved people, you can see that the enslaved population greatly outnumbers the land holding population. And then there's a group of people who often get ignored in the history of the Haitian Revolution, but they're critically important. And these are the 30,000 either free people of color or people who had run away from enslavement. Those people who had run away and who had created their own communities largely in the mountainous regions in Saint-Domingue, those people were often known as marrons. That comes from the word itself can also often just be used in terms of meaning like people of color or people of dark skin color, but the word marron becomes known as maroon. So maroon communities. And today we often use the term maroon to indicate people who live like separate. Like if you're marooned on an island, it means you're left alone, right? Abandoned. So maroon communities were communities of slaves, formerly enslaved people who had run away, and they created their own sort of rebellious communities. Now they could be arrested, they could be re-enslaved at any point, so they really had to live on their own. But you had about 30,000 people of color who were not accounted for under the slavery system. Either they were free, often meaning that they were of mixed ancestry. Often what would happen is you would have the children of slave owners, often born of rape, who would be given their freedom by their dads, which, that's big of them. And then they sometimes even own property. And sometimes those free people of color also were slave owners. This system is very complex, and it's really hard to just kind of look for moral absolutes here. But what you need to understand is that Saint-Domingue had a history of slave rebellions. And this is really critical for us to understand when we think about slavery, and especially when we think about chattel slavery. Sometimes you hear people make terrible arguments that slavery couldn't have been that bad because people didn't rebel. Number one, that's not true. Like, the history of slavery is a history of rebellion if you look at the documents, if you look at the actual experience. Whenever there is slavery of any form, people fight to get out of it. And in Saint-Domingue in particular, there was an incredibly important attempted slave revolt in the 18th century. This was led by a fellow by the name of François Mackendal, or at least that's how he's referred to in the French documents. We're fairly certain that Mackendal was from West Africa. We think he was Muslim, and we think he was literate. And he essentially tried to unite various plantations and enslaved people together to rise up against their masters. He encouraged people who were working within the plantation houses to poison their masters, which many of them did, and to kind of raid the storehouses, take any weapons that weren't nailed down, and then rise up and try to establish their independence. They scared the bejesus out of the French Grand Blancs who owned plantations there. However, Mackendal and his followers weren't a military. They didn't have a communication system. They didn't have a reliable system of essentially establishing order. They didn't have like sort of the structure that you need to end a system of enslavement. And so unfortunately, Mackendal was captured, as were many of his followers, and they were executed after brutal torture. So there was a history of slave rebellion in Saint-Domingue. And it did two things. Number one, it scared the crud out of slave owners. They were terrified of another Mackendal revolt. And it also scared the crap out of enslaved people because they saw what happened to Mackendal and his followers. I mean, when people are flayed alive or their entrails ripped out and done in public, like that discourages people from revolting. But so the Mackendal revolt happens in the middle of the 18th century. And then the French Revolution across the Atlantic starts to get going. The French Revolution begins in 1789. And one thing you have to remember is that by the 18th century, it takes about 3 weeks to get across the Atlantic Ocean by ship. Ships are pretty fast, and so within 3 weeks of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen being written and signed, it is over in Saint-Domingue, and it is being read aloud on docks while people are reading the newspapers coming out of Paris. And while many enslaved people were forbidden to be able to learn to read, some enslaved people had learned. And so what they did was they would smuggle the newspapers and then they would read them and they would pass that information around their fellows. Now, if you've ever played a game of telephone, okay, then you know that when you start spreading information, often it gets twisted and a little bit changed as it goes. So what this meant was that when they saw some news articles indicating that there was an abolitionist sentiment amongst some of the more revolutionary members over in France in the National Assembly, back in Haiti, or back in Saint-Domingue, some enslaved people took that to mean that the revolution in France was going to result in the freedom of enslaved people in Saint-Domingue, which would have been nice and frankly would have been consistent with a lot of the ideals being espoused by some of the revolutionaries over in France. So this right here is, of course, Saint-Domingue. It's today Haiti. This area up here in the north, this is the area we're going to need to watch because this is the area that is least under control of the crown. This is Port-au-Prince, which is the capital city here. This is where the information is coming in, but also this is the area that is in the strongest control of the French. Now, and this, of course, is a sugar plantation. You can see the various portions of it here. These are the crushing gears where you would feed in the sugar cane. These are the places where you would pour the syrup and let it boil very, very, very slowly. These are the molds behind them over here, and here's where they're cutting the cane. Now, so 3 years after the revolution in France had begun, in 1791, what you saw was people who were enslaved taking the ideals of the revolution very, very seriously and using it as kind of an inspiration to kind of get their courage up and rising up against the masters in their plantations, particularly up in the north where there was less French control. Now, these revolts were sporadic. They were not centrally controlled. There was no military-like structure around this. No one person is leading these revolts. Instead, what you saw was communities of Marrons, okay, Maroon communities, aiding and abetting these rebellions, and they're trying to help people gain their freedom. Now, this is mostly guerrilla type warfare where you strike and retreat. This is because the enslaved people don't have the means to actually hold territory. Now, when they're attacking these plantations, what's fascinating to me is that these enslaved people and these Maroons are attacking, and they are using the terminology and the context of the French Revolution when they're attacking. They see themselves not as slaves, but as members of the sans-culottes. They see themselves as kind of the French underclass. They see themselves as part of the revolution. In fact, they're calling themselves citoyens, citizen. They're not thinking of themselves as slaves ending a system of slavery, but as French citizens demanding their rights. And that's a remarkable thing. They're seeing themselves as part of the Republic, not as a separate group. And that's what's really interesting to me about the Haitian Revolution, is if you in a certain way, you can think of it as part of the French Revolution, not something separate from it. So I'm going to pause here and then we're going to pick up in the second video.